A few years ago, I was in Kansas City meeting with Senator Bob Dole, and he was giving a speech later that day, but he had asked me to come down to meet about some business of the Dole Institute of Politics, and at the end of our meeting he declared to me, well, I would like to go over into Kansas to meet some voters. And you know, an old politician, you can't change him at all. So he wanted to go and shake hands with some Kansas voters. So we wound up in Overland Park, and we wound up specifically in Old Overland Park. And for those of you who've never been there, it's kind of a square type area, kind of a typical. It's not really a square, but it's kind of like a small town square. There's lots of businesses and shops. And we went into a coffee shop there, and one of the young baristas in the coffee shop really seemed to notice that this was Bob Dole. And he really seemed to focus on that, but he didn't say anything. So the senator and I went around the rest of the businesses, and as we were about ready to get into my car and I was ready to drive him back downtown, this young barista came running across the street as rapidly as he could. And you could tell he was really kind of nervous and that he was about to do something that was very important to him. And so he came up to Senator Dole and he said, "Senator Dole, sir, you're probably the most important person I will ever meet in my life." And he said, "I want to give this to you because this is my passion. This is what I care most about in life." And he passed a little sheet of paper with a handwritten note on it that had a website, www.childsoldier.org. That young man knew something that far too many Americans are oblivious to: the vast employment of children as soldiers, particularly in Africa. It's impossible to know how many children have been forced to fight, but experts say easily in the tens of thousands. From 2004 to 2007, children were engaged as soldiers in 19 countries. This is a major international tragedy that is obviously of great interest to us, but also the United Nations. Today, we are honored to welcome Ms. Radhika Coomaraswamy to the Dole Institute. Ms. Coomaraswamy was appointed Undersecretary General, Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict in April 2006. In this capacity, she serves as a moral voice and independent advocate to build awareness and give prominence to the rights and protection of boys and girls affected by armed conflict. Ms. Coomaraswamy, a lawyer by training and formerly the chairperson of the Sri Lanka Human Rights Commission, is an internationally known human rights advocate. In her reports to the United Nations, she has written on violence in the family, violence in the community, violence against women during armed conflict, and the problem of international trafficking. A strong advocate on women's rights, she has intervened on behalf of countless women throughout the world, seeking clarification from governments in cases involving violence against women. Her resume is extensive. I think you have a bio, and so I'm not going to go through it in detail, but she's been published extensively, has received many awards, and has degrees from, among others, Yale, Harvard, and Columbia. The Under General Secretary will be interviewed today by Dole Institute Associate Directors Jonathan Earl and Barbara Ballard. Please welcome Ms. Radhika Coomaraswamy.
Thanks, Bill. And I also wanted to single out for special thanks my friend Jay Shervin from the United Nations Association of Greater Kansas City, who gave me a call this August and told me about this distinguished visitor and allowed us at the University of Kansas and the Dole Institute to have this program today. So thank you very much. I get to start things off, and I asked the Madam Undersecretary General what I should call her, whether I should call her Special Representative of the Secretary General or Madam Undersecretary General, and she said, "Call me Radhika," which is so much easier. So thank you. But Radhika, you have a background, as we heard, in the law. How did you become involved in something like the fight to stop child soldiers and in the international movement against it?
Well, actually, I owe a lot to my education in the United States, where I did a lot of work in public interest cases when I was a student at Columbia University. So I had a strong interest in this kind of work. And back home in Sri Lanka, I worked a lot on women's rights and human rights. But I must say I hadn't focused on children, but in 2006, at 4 in the morning, I remember, I got a phone call, and it was from Mr. Kofi Annan, and he said, "I'd like you to take this post on." And I said, "Well, you know, I'm not a specialist on children's rights, I'm a specialist on women's rights." He said, "No, I just want a very strong advocate, someone who understands human rights issues." And so that's how I got this post, and now I've become passionate about this issue.
I'll pick up on that. How did this issue emerge from the United Nations?
Well, what happened was 10 years ago, there were these wars primarily in Africa, but other parts of the world as well, where there were visual images, I think, of child soldiers and other problems associated with conflict. And what Kofi Annan did was appoint Graça Machel, who is Nelson Mandela's wife, to do a 3-year study on the situation of children in armed conflict. And she presented her study, I think, in 1996. And it was a horrific picture. So it was a decision of the United Nations collectively then to appoint at the highest level, which is the Under-Secretary General level, a representative on children in armed conflict who would try and steer this issue through the United Nations and be a spokesman for it globally. So it was really Graça Machel's initial work and her report that laid the foundation of this office and really galvanized at least UN attention on children in armed conflict.
Well, it sounds like, and you mentioned Kofi Annan, you mentioned the Mandela family. A lot of people associate the problem of child soldiers with the continent of Africa. Is this accurate, or are there other parts of the world, including where you're from, where this is a severe problem as well?
Well, in the sense that the largest numbers may be coming from Africa, but what we're finding is that's not the only continent. We have child soldiers in wars in Nepal, in Myanmar or Burma, in the Philippines, in Sri Lanka, my own country. So we have in Asia, and in Latin America, of course, in Colombia, the FARC, the ELN, and even the paramilitaries operating in Colombia recruit children. And strangely, at one point, we also had child soldiers in the Sinn Féin in the Northern Ireland War at some point, when they were also reported on by the UN. And also, we are now faced with a new kind of child soldier, which is very frightening, which is the child suicide bomber. We've had these come to the fore in Iraq and Afghanistan. So these are new dimensions also and giving us new challenges.
That's interesting. I'm going to jump a question here. Would you say this is a global poverty thing? Well, why would it exist in those countries?
Well, I think on the one hand, you have certain kinds of, we had in the 1990s and late 1980s, what I would call just pathological movements like the Lord's Resistance Army and the RUF of Sierra Leone, which based on mineral resources was their base, and Charles Taylor's army, which abducted children, drugged them, and sent them to war. But that phase is slowly moving out. We're out of that phase, and you know, now with especially the trial in The Hague of Charles Taylor and others, I think that phase is moving out. But what we're having now is this so-called children joining groups voluntarily, in quotation marks, and they do so sometimes out of poverty because they don't have many resources. Sometimes families give the children over to the armed groups, or there are many orphans in Africa. This is one problem that's never looked at, the enormous number of orphans in Africa due to AIDS and a whole host of other factors. And also, I think it's 3 square meals a day. So poverty is one issue. The second area is, you know, especially in ethnic groups and class discrimination. People feel discriminated against, perceive humiliation. When that kind of thing, children tend to join, or parents, such as the Tutsi families in eastern Congo, give their children over to the armed groups as a sort of to protect the ethnic group kind of thing. Then you have in many other countries, you know, martyrdom and heroic death in the name of a cause, religious and ethnic. That also you're having, and children are easily manipulated with these kinds of ideas to become heroes, and you know, to die a romantic death for the cause is something that they can easily be manipulated.
That's an interesting point. So there's this ability to recruit children by exploiting their own interest in romantic martyrdom, death, violence. I guess I'm going to steal a question from one of my students when I was discussing your visit, and she asked me, how do you recruit somebody to be a soldier who's a child? And that seems like part of the answer, like to
play to their romanticize it. Well, sometimes you just abduct them, but otherwise, but to romanticize also the cause and attract them. You know, children are preferred by some armed groups because, firstly, they don't have a fully formed concept of death. So they will go directly into the line of fire.
Right.
And so therefore there is that issue, and they will fight fearlessly. So that's one reason that people like. Then secondly, they obey leaders. They don't. There's no personality issues. Right. They're very good fighters that way. And thirdly, it just takes them 45 minutes, according to people who know, 45 minutes to master an AK-47.
45 minutes?
Yeah.
Well, I definitely see people at Best Buy, the kids who are playing video games can do things that I could never imagine doing.
Well, you know, these
first-person shooter games.
Well, one of the reasons also is the small arms is now so available in these countries because when the weapons were heavier, it was more difficult for children to be soldiers. But now, with the smaller arms and lighter weapons, it's more likely that they are.
That's interesting. Are they really willing to do this, even though you may romanticize it? But you say abducted, coerced. Are their parents afraid? They can't stop it. What's the other risk?
Well, in a sense that once they're abducted, if you read, one of the books that I would recommend is this book by Ishmael Beer called A Long Way Gone, and it's a story of his life as a child soldier, how he was basically abducted. But it shows you, even if you're abducted or you join voluntarily, once you join the group, there's a certain brainwashing that takes place, a certain cult it's like cults that takes place, and children they do kill and do go out and do those things because they feel they are part of this group and this is the thing to do. They know nothing different.
I think sometimes in the United States we have trouble focusing on more than one international issue at a time, and at the risk of making it more confusing, is there a part of the world where this is going on that we don't know about and should know a lot more? I mean, I know there was the big book about the Lost Boys of Sudan who got some media play, but is that even the center of this anymore?
Well, I think there are very strong international NGOs now dealing with the issue of child soldiers. So I think there is information out there if one wants to get it. The Coalition Against Child Soldiers publishes a global report every year on country by country analysis on the issue of child soldiers. We in the UN publish an annual report every year to the Security Council where we do basically 19 situations where we say there are child soldiers. So it's well known where they are. And I think some of the things, it's difficult to collect data on the numbers. Like, for example, in Somalia, we know that Al-Shabaab is recruiting in very large numbers, but that's exact estimates and all that is very difficult because we have no access. Where we have no access, it's more difficult.
Besides recruiting to wars to fight, what about the sexual violence that we read about and also the exploitation of labor?
Yeah. Well, sexual violence, again, in those, what I call those pathological situations of Charles Taylor and Coney and all these people, was basically girls were abducted. I mean, I'll tell you the story of someone like Grace who was abducted, then from northern Uganda, she was forced to first gang raped and then handed over to one of the commanders, and then also made to fight. So on the one hand they're wives, on the other hand they're also combatants. Then some of them have children from these alliances. So when you're trying to demobilize and release them, it becomes very problematic because they're torn. Should they stay with the man who is the father of the child, or should they take the child and start a new life? All these issues arise for former combatants, especially of those wars. And of course, but there are other contexts where, of course, sexual violence is a tool of war, where going into villages, etc., as a form of terrorizing, especially another ethnic group. It happened in Bosnia. It happens in Eastern Congo, where rape is a means of terrorizing the population, intimidating them. So we have that situation too, especially in Eastern Congo at the moment.
Sounds like they're closely related. I guess we've kind of talked about some of the underlying causes and some of the general questions, but in addition to having the United Nations and at the top levels receiving reports and protocols and dealing with the issue, what are some of the solutions that you can think of? How can we help to eradicate this?
Well, I think there are three ways that we have to deal with prevention on the one hand, and then I think we have to deal with justice and punishment issues. And finally, we have to deal with the children once they've been released, how we're going to deal with them. With regard to prevention, as you say, to understand the root causes and to try and organize the community against children being recruited. I mean, UN is through UNDP and UNICEF is trying to do that in communities, but it always depends on whether you have access, because in many parts of this, the UN has no access. So therefore, we can't organize or at least build the capacity, help build the capacity of the country and the community to protect itself. But with regard to deterrence and punishment and justice, those issues, as you know, the International Criminal Court has the first case it decided to try was the case of Thomas Lubanga, which is a case of child soldiers. So there's an international criminal prosecution now in 6 cases that's taking place at the ICC. And then, you know, the Security Council, as you know, has taken up this issue with the possibility of sanctions against those who recruit and use children as child soldiers. And we have a list every year of 19 persistent violators, for example, that continue to use children.
I assume that since the International Criminal Court has decided to make their very first prosecution for this crime, that this is a very high priority.
It is a very high priority. It raises a lot of very interesting legal questions, but it's the first time, you know, lawyers are excited because it's the first time that that we're going to be defining what it means to participate in hostilities. You know, for example, does it mean only the combatant, or does it also mean the wife?
Oh, good point.
Those kinds of issues will be coming up before the court.
But it sounds also like, you know, since you mentioned justice very high in your answer, this seems to be going beyond the model of, say, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in post-apartheid South Africa, where it's basically tell the truth and move on. This sounds like you want people put away.
We feel that adults who commit war crimes, which this is, and crimes against humanity should be put away. Yeah. We think that children, people who committed the acts under 18, should go through a truth and reconciliation process. The UN's approach is that, in Sierra Leone, and it's been in also, I think, the ICC, that those who bear the greatest responsibility in these war crimes and crimes against humanity will be prosecuted. The others could go through a truth and reconciliation process.
I have a two-part question. So if you are able to get the children and rehabilitate them, does that work?
Well, this is a very interesting question. It's a question for now about 20 years of experience with regard to this, especially UNICEF and Save the Children and others have, which is, it can work. There are a lot of people who have emerged from this conflict, you know. Mr. Iwa, he's here, for example. He is an example of someone who was former child soldier from Biafra, who is now a professor. We have a network of former child soldiers who are now authors and musicians and doing all kinds of things. So it can work, but it needs the investment. And I think to some extent we have found that the best way to do that is not only to teach them skills that are marketable, but also to work with the family and the community to rebuild trust between them and their families and their communities.
I want to talk about some legislation when we talk about preventing it. Senator Sam Brownback from Kansas has introduced a bill that would restrict any U.S. assistance to countries that engaged in recruitment or child soldiering. What do you think about that?
No, we're very much. In fact, I went up to the Hill and spoke to Senator Brownback and Senator Durbin. I think it's a joint bill, it's a bipartisan bill, and it has two parts. One is that anyone committing these crimes will be prosecuted in the United States, so it criminalizes child recruitment. And secondly, it says that no aid will be given to countries in which armed forces are recruiting children. And thirdly, and more importantly, it doesn't allow, it has an immigration aspect too, it denies. So it's a very strong bill, we support it fully.
We'll keep an eye on that legislation.
It's passed?
Oh, it's all passed?
It's passed.
And that's
passed
fantastic.
last year.
Okay, thanks. We'll send a letter of thanks.
Well, let me ask,
Senators Durbin and Brownback.
Well, if it has passed, how long will it take it to be enforced? Because normally you pass a bill, but it doesn't happen immediately. It takes a while before anything really happens.
That I don't know.
Okay.
But I know it was passed. It was passed nearly unanimously.
We talked a little bit about relocation, and I just recently learned that a lot of the Lost Boys of Sudan that I read about have relocated to the Midwest, Omaha, Kansas City, right around here. Is it better to take these former soldiers out of their communities, or is it better to rehabilitate in the places where they grew up?
We, as a rule, there's something called the Paris Principles, which set out the rules that we are guided by when we're reintegrating children. And we feel that the most important thing for the children is to be reunited with their families and their communities, and that gives a certain moral base for them. And a certain support base for them. If not, but I think sometimes we have to make exceptions. Now, for example, in Nepal, some of the girl soldiers, they don't want to go home. They say, we go home, we don't want to live these traditions. They're now used to a certain freedom, making certain kinds of decisions, to go back to this traditional Asian notion of submissive wife. They don't want to go home. So you have that situation. But as a general rule, taking them home, having them, and rebuilding that relationship. And second, next to family is education, getting them into a certain normalcy with regard to education and structure in their lives is usually the best.
You know, I'm going to follow up on something. In all the readings, they keep talking about the Tamil tigers. Would you tell us a little bit more about Tamil tigers?
Well, in Sri Lanka, as you know, there was at a particular, after independence, the Tamils, who are a minority, began to have a sense of grievance that they were being discriminated against. So initially there were protests and parties that were non-violent, that grew up in protesting. But then around 1971, 72, there became groups that began to use armed force. One of these groups was the Liberation Tigers of Tamil. And then what happened over the course of the next 20 years is that they eliminated everybody, killed off all their competitors, and including the democratic leaders, and then became a very ruthless machine. But we must also say that the Sri Lankan state, in responding to the Tamil Tigers, also engaged in a lot of human rights violations. So it was a kind of a terrible situation. So in May this year, in a brutal confrontation between the army and the Tigers leadership was decimated. But of course, there is the issue which all of us in the human rights community have pointed out to the Sri Lankan government. There is that issue of Tamil grievances. And so to some extent, those have to be dealt with politically. And that is now the question of the hour. Will the government rise to the occasion? First, will it resettle all the IDPs that it's keeping in camps? And then will it come up with a political solution for for what are grievances, devoid of the tigers or whatever?
Okay.
A kind of a more United States-centric question, but how are children being affected by the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan? We don't hear about children too much. You mentioned the new phenomenon, a relatively new phenomenon of children being used as suicide bombers.
Children are deeply affected in Iraq and Afghanistan, because traditional war had two principles: the principle of distinction, which was the separation of combatants from civilians, and the second is the use of proportional force. Both these are no longer applicable in these regions, and you have basically civilians as targets. So as a result, from regard to children, we have the phenomenon of child suicide bombers. Secondly, we have the phenomenon in Afghanistan and southern Thailand and some parts of Iraq of schools, girls' schools especially, being attacked, girl students and teachers, because they don't want girls to study. Al-Qaeda has something. Thirdly, we have just bombs being put in predominantly civilian places, which kill children. But then also in responding to this, we have violations, which is that children are now being held in large numbers in detention by the forces fighting terrorism. And we also have this whole phenomenon which is now being debated in Afghanistan within the US military, which is the collateral damage issue, which is whether it's drones or whether it is aerial bombardment. If a terrorist is in a house and he's with his and they always go around with their families and things, do you drop the bomb knowing it's going to kill the wife, the children, and the grandparents? And this is a very interesting issue. And recently I was in a conference in London where and I think General McChrystal in Afghanistan has said, protection of civilians is going to be one of the center of the new strategy, and also for United Nations peacekeeping in Congo, etc. While protection of civilians is something they did on the side, it was not central to their operation. But what we are arguing is that in planning military operations, that protection of civilians, including children, should be a key part of that, and that I think is a new thinking in peacekeeping, at least.
That raises a question for me. The role of a mother seems to be, you want to protect your children, you want to help give them the best. The role of the father is to be in that role. What happens when you're recruiting as soldiers and they don't have like the mother, but they have another kind of authoritarian figure? And what happens to the family structure in the country as a result of this?
Well, I think war anyway takes a heavy toll on family structures. And if you're recruiting now, for example, in Pakistan, what happens in Afghanistan, when I went there recently and talked to some of the families, they send their children to Pakistan's madrasas with the genuine belief that they want to educate their children in a Islamic setting. The parents, they're not sending them to be suicide bombers. But then in these madrasas, there are some unscrupulous mullahs and others who then take these children and as you know, abuse them, as well as send them to be suicide bombers or fight or whatever. So in that sense, a lot of this is the parents sending children to groups thinking they're going to be brought up in an Islamic world, and then having them being abused and exploited.
Fantastic. We've taken, I think, about as much time as we should. I see Chelsea Mertz in the back with a microphone. If you have a question for the Undersecretary General, please raise your hand. Chelsea will come find you, and I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that we left out.
Thank you. I'm curious about how, in a world where there's a strong cultural influence on the definition of when childhood ends, how it is that the UN arrived at the age of 18, and whether or not that has been an issue in determining people's capacity to consent to these kinds of roles in war.
Well, that's a very important question, which is that when you go to some of these, as part of my work, I meet some of these non-state actors, and first thing they'll say is, "Who said 18? I mean, this child. This is not a child. He's a man." and the notion that childhood is really a construction, and that in some cultures 14 or 15 is when children, I think that, well, I think the age 18 is based, I think, on some notion, scientific notion coming from Piaget and all the other psychologists that children don't have full moral reasoning, etc., until they're 18. So I think there is a scientific base. And I think the cultural traditions that have childhood end at 14, etc., still continue and causing this dilemma. But I think we should see 18 as an aspirational document. Everybody agrees with it. It's 100% around the world that 18 should be the era. I mean, at least governments around the world. One thing, they're not disputing that should be the age. So it's really an aspiration, and the UN is standing by that aspiration. And we feel that we should work toward it through education programs, as well as through the law and others. So it's a transformative project to make the whole world kind of respect childhood and let children be children until they're 18.
Can I just follow up on that a little bit? She said, we were talking about 18, but often it talks about 14. How young are they recruiting these children to come?
There's a commander of the Mai Mai in the Congo who's 10.
Breathtaking.
It is.
Yeah. Labo.
Thank you very much for your talk and answers you gave. I'm wondering about the kinds of rehabilitation for these child soldiers. We have this situation, it's an unconventional war. The elders have fought this war, many of them have perpetrated all sorts of atrocities. So then the children, their youth have been destroyed, they have known war. What happens now to the future of the country? Because we have now kind of discredited elders and, traumatized children. So it seems to be a vacuum. Is there something in the rehabilitation being done to cope or take care of the future of these nations?
In the old days, with regard to rehabilitation, what we would do, UNICEF and Save the Children, UNICEF is my eyes and ears on the ground, so I work through them, is that we would take these children, the donors would give you money to keep them in a transit center, and you would teach them certain skills, and then after a month, up to 6 months maybe, and then you would release them. That's it. Give them some cash handout and release them. It's a disaster because they go back, their families can't cope with them because, they have learned to fight, so it's very difficult. They get re-recruited or they go into crime and those. So the more we worked, we found that the best way is really that as soon as they're found, that we trace the families and take them back to the family, right? And then the work begins. You work with the family. And if the community, if it's not in an IDP camp, but if it's a post-conflict situation, with the community. If you're going to give services like building a school, education or whatever, you give the same thing to all the other children in the community, because one thing you can't be seeing is letting it look like a child soldier is benefiting while others are not getting those services. So really, more and more it has been that we want to work with the family and the community together, not only the child, so that you really rebuild his environment. But of course, this means resources. And donors are still not, they still think in the 6 months to teach him mechanics and sewing and send them back, mold. So we're trying to work, and one of the things I do for my partners on the ground is advocate to give 2-year programming, where you have work with the family and the community, let them go back. And also the constant follow-up. It's very important to train social workers to continue to visit the family, and at least for a 2 to 3 year period. So that's the recent thinking on the.
All right. You talked about how adults would be prosecuted and children would go through a truth and reconciliation process. Do you see children kind of aging out of the program, starting as child soldiers and becoming the ones in charge? And if so, would they be prosecuted with special consideration, or how would that be handled?
That's an excellent question. There's actually a case in point at the moment. There's I can't remember, Ingo Wen, I think his name is, from northern Uganda. He was recruited as a child soldier when he was 10, and then he became one of the LRA's commanders in adulthood in the late 20s. Now he is being prosecuted by the ICC for the acts he committed as an adult. A lot of the child soldier advocates are saying, well, that's, you know, he was a child soldier, this is all he knows, can you really put him on trial? So this raises this whole issue. I must say that I don't know where I come out on this at the moment. I'm thinking about it, I'm talking to different people as to whether we should put out a statement or something on this case. Because in the sense that he did commit very heinous crimes as an adult, but he was once a child soldier. So my sense is the law is that once you commit the crime, I mean, how much, in all these, you get a point is how much do you understand a person and therefore not prosecute them. And I think if you take this understanding too much, then you will not prosecute anybody, because everybody has some childhood problem or something, and that's why they're killing people. So at some point you have to say, well, look, you have to take responsibility for your acts and be prosecuted for it. So I think to say that being prosecuted for over 18, what you do after you're 18, is a valid way, and the ICC is correct, I think.
Thank you so much for coming and talking to us. My name is Meninda Kaur. I'm a physician by training, and I've worked in Nepal, Zimbabwe, Africa, and now in Haiti. And what you're talking about is, I've seen it. So it's a very emotional response that you get when you've actually seen a woman who's been desecrated in this way, and you see the results of it. So excuse me for my tears. But how does, can you, most of the time that I've been in these kind of situations, I've gone with small non-profits. And I've seen how UNICEF works on the ground. And I've often wondered whether the largeness of the UNICEF comes between the real work that's being done in the trenches, and whether it would be better to outsource what you do to small non-profits who are struggling every minute of every day. And that's my first, and I'm sorry, another question, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask it anyway. How does one get more involved? I mean, would you recommend certain non-profits that are better than others?
Great question.
Well, let me say first, we do outsource, really. UNICEF itself no longer does the actual, in say, Eastern Congo, doesn't in itself do the program. What we try and do is find especially local NGOs and even international NGOs who we feel have the capacity, or we try and build up their capacity for them to do the work, so that there's local capacity developed. So we do outsource to local NGOs, and especially reintegration to local NGOs and to international NGOs. And UNICEF itself does not do the rehabilitation or the reintegration. It just supports the various capacities on the ground. Secondly, with regard to, I think there are some who are better than others. I think Save the Children is excellent. I think you will find that the Norwegian Relief Agency is also quite good. Let me see who else. World Vision does a lot of important work. That's also very good. Those are the three that come to mind immediately. And also the Catholic organization Caritas does a lot of work. They work very quietly, and they manage to get into areas that nobody else can get into. Caritas. World Vision is more, not so much Catholic, it's Christian, but Caritas is Catholic. Aritas.
For that, other questions?
This isn't really a question, this is a comment. My name is Bobby Francis McDonald, and I'm an advocate for a just and lasting peace for Sudan. And I've been doing it for 10 years, and I would like to make a comment on something that you said more than once. You cited several times the lost boys in conjunction with a statement about child soldiers. It's been my experience in 10 years of doing this, and starting out in southern Sudan, where the lost boys came from, I would say if even 1% of the lost boys had ever been a child soldier, I would be surprised. The lost boys are lost boys because their families were wiped out by the aggressors, and they became the lost boys, so they were not child soldiers. And since there are so many lost boys in Kansas City and Oma, I wouldn't want people looking at them and thinking, oh, some of these people have been child soldiers. But there were child soldiers in the conflicts in Sudan.
But even, I mean, this is certainly, everyone who knows my specialty, I'm an antebellum American historian. But some of the things we're saying is that even if they were child soldiers or not, I'm not sure that people should necessarily be stigmatized in that way anyway. But I'm sure you know more than I if you've been at this for 10 years.
Though the SPLA did recruit, but as you're right, the lost boys were those who escaped and got away. But
there's in Sudan, in southern Sudan, there is an NGO sponsored by Christian organizations called Reconcile, all capital letters, and they not only do trauma healing for all of the people who've been affected by the war, particularly the children, but they teach indigenous people to go out into their own communities and do the trauma healing themselves, so they're not having others, maybe Europeans or Westerners, coming in and doing it to them. They're teaching the people in their communities to reach out within the communities and do that.
Which I might add, if you're doing it within, it's easier for people to accept it because they realize you understand more of what the culture is and what happens, and it can be ongoing.
Mm-hmm. Though this is a very interesting debate, it's a very big debate in the response community, whether you use indigenous ways of trauma healing or bring in things like post-traumatic stress syndrome concepts, and whether you my sense is that for the vast majority, traditional healing methods are fine and work, and using it is, but there is always like a 5% where I think they really do need, go ahead.
Reconcile is doing trauma healing, post-traumatic stress, teaching the indigenous people those concepts. So the indigenous people are doing the Western.
Oh, good.
Okay. But in other parts, like in my own country, Sri Lanka, there's a big debate because people prefer that they be put through Buddhist meditation rather than psychiatric. So then it becomes a real issue because some people are really ill and meditation is not going to help them. So those kinds of concerns do come up.
I just wanted to follow up on that because I was part of one of these kind of rehab sort of things, and I'm Asian in origin, and I see tremendous value in meditation. Yet I also see value in intervention in Western terms, and oftentimes the Western ideas, if they are framed in a different way, make perfect sense to the culture at large that you're working in, and thereby, giving them sort of a cultural context that that's a little more meaningful. And it comes really from the attitude of tremendous respect for the culture, and yet sort of a dialogue that emerges from that respect,
right,
which is neither east nor west, it's just human.
I had noticed on the information we were provided that there are 6 million plus rendered permanently disabled children. That's just an astounding number to me. And you've talked about reconciliation. I guess my question is, what type of a future in the countries where this appears to be occurring, what type of hope do we have to help that type of number of children in those countries to have any kind of a future?
That is the real difficult area, because the countries don't have the resources sometimes to give these children a real education and to integrate them fully into the community, and that's a real issue. And what we're trying to say is that there's so many children that have been disabled by war in certain societies that in the post-reconstruction planning there should be non-discrimination about especially children with disabilities, and that should be an integral part of rebuilding society, that the disabilities issue should be center. One of the issues that whether you're rebuilding buildings or whether you're dealing with education, that this issue not be lost. That's one of the things that has been argued in both Sierra Leone and Liberia, because there's so many children who have been disabled not only because they've been combatants but also in war.
How does the United Nations arrive at these numbers? I've heard the number of 250,000 child soldiers and
well, UNICEF has a database which they keep from the different conflicts, and it's been extrapolated, but it's really a guesstimate.
Yeah.
Because now Al-Shabaab operating in Somalia, we estimate about 50% at least, according to UNICEF, they think are child soldiers, but how do we know?
Other questions? Oh, right here, sir.
Thank you. I'm still, as a former child soldier, I'm still angry. And I just wonder why it never goes away. I suffer constantly from identity crisis. I don't know who I am, even though I have PhD and I'm an associate professor. Very, very angry, even though I'm a political scientist. At one time, my parents were British protected citizens in Nigeria. At another time, my parents made a transition to become Nigerians. At another time, we still made yet another transition to become Biafrans because we were beheaded by the Muslims in northern Nigeria. And so they brought us headless bodies home and forced us, I was a houseboy then, and they forced us to become soldiers to fight for our survival. Since then, the world has long forgotten the Republic of Biafra, and so many of us are in exile. We suffer from lustration and epuration. We can't get job, we can't get security offices or any good office in our countries. So without countries like the United States, we have no jobs with PhDs. The war that was fought since long ago has not ended. It swept under the carpet. The crisis in the Delta area of Nigeria is still the same people who fought the Biafran war. That's it. It has been replicated. The Biafran incident has been replicated in Darfur, in Sudan. Because the Igbo chaps who fought in the Congo in 1960 are the ones who returned and couldn't take it anymore from the Nigerians. So they are interconnected. So I'm asking, how can I am one of the few experts on transitional justice. I'm trying to develop a theory of Inweronye, the limb of nobody.
Sorry?
Inweronye, that's my language.
Uh-huh.
Inweronye, the theory of Inweronye, the non-person, the long-forgotten child and victim of war. So how can we create a kind of child transitional justice? Transitional justice simply means how do societies and government deal with the unpleasant past? This is where I want really, can we create models? Like I've worked with Freedom School model here from kindergarten to primary, and then to develop community college model and evening university model that we can market along West Africa and others, just as the Under-Secretary General very well stated. Dealing with us individually will not make any much difference, but creating models, educational models and others, and presenting people like us to see that, you see, education is the key in the 21st century. We can make it. I made it as a former child soldier. Another one word I just wish to add is that the pattern of fighting has changed. When I was a child soldier, we attacked the Nigerian Muslim soldiers. We ambushed their vehicles, and we dealt with them severely. We protected because we were posted. I was a child commander, and we were posted to our own communities to protect our people. And so if I did anything, they say, that's Unoke's son, So we could not attack anybody at home because it will destroy our families. That pattern has since gone. We worked with Caritas. We worked with the U.S. Food Supply, Red Cross and all, and nobody knew that we were child soldiers. So it has changed. So it's good for us to get out there in the field and at least present ourselves along the West African coast in Sierra Leone, where they were amputating people's hands, and to say, another life is possible for the child soldier. So I just want to thank you for your coming.
Thank you. And an excellent question about how do we develop these models?
Yes, I must put you in touch with UNICEF. Is doing a huge program on children and transitional justice. And the Innocenti Center in Florence, which is their research wing, this is one of their main, and the idea is to try and build these models and to find what is the best. And there are various examples, as you know, from indigenous healing models, where to truth and reconciliation, to kind of have them do service, to the community. So there are various models that they're working with, and I should put you in touch with them.
Thank you, because Western model of human rights sometimes African component, that you can.
But I think in Angola and Mozambique they did use indigenous models.
Yeah, the Ubuntu philosophy in TIA. All the models. I'm because you are. You are nothing without me. I'm nothing without you. Philosophy that Nelson Mandela.
I want to thank you very much, because the question I asked you is, can they be rehabilitated? And we said yes. Well, I think there's proof that you can rehabilitate, but it doesn't mean that the anger, the hurt, the lost childhood, the protectiveness, all of that, you can't get that back. You can get something.
Adults were incapable of handling their own situation. I didn't know why. That I'm owing it to the dead people, heaps of heedless people that died. So I am here. We made presentations yesterday. I almost packed my whole college to come. Now I've left classes because I must listen. Every word you see there is So I'm trying to come to terms with you. Yeah. That is almost impossible. They destroyed my childhood.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being here. He won't need his mic now. But I want to thank you very much for being here, because I think you gave a lot of credibility, because we can talk about it, certainly Radhika can talk about it, but you're talking about it from it happened to me, I experienced it, and if we have offered this opportunity for you to get all you can to make you feel better, I am so glad. You're welcome.
We thank her for being here.
Thank you.
We have time for one or two more questions. So a gentleman here, and then us, and then maybe a final student question.
Thank you for coming. I'm from Kenya, and then you talked about these problems being mostly in Africa. So my question to you is about the resources. When some of the individuals who are affected by the war, children and the parents, move to the neighboring countries, it creates a real problem in terms of the resources. The country where they are moving to don't have a lot of resources, and these countries are already dealing with their own political issues. So my specific question to you is, what is the United Nations doing in terms of setting out the resources, specifically financially, and making sure that these resources are being used properly, because we know in Africa there is a lot of corruption?
Thank you. First, let me say that the majority of, the issue is important in Africa, but it's also an Asian issue. Nepal, Philippines, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Pakistan. So I think, we shouldn't be, it is true, it came to the world's consciousness because of Africa, but it is really an Asian African problem, and also Latin America, Colombia. But with regard to the resources, basically what the UN puts out there, in Kenya, of course, is the host of so many refugee communities. Somalia, it was throughout all these wars. So in that sense, what the UN puts out there is services of its UNHCR. As you know, most of the refugee camps are run with the resources provided by UNHCR. Then the World Food Program provides the food for these camps mainly. UNICEF provides education and child space in these camps. This is how we're supposed to work, that whenever there's an emergency, these organizations rush in and are supposed to create supplement the government's resources, and they themselves will actually fund those situations. So that's the ideal situation, and I think in some places it does work, that the camps are quite well run. Even in Sudan, Darfur, the camps now are all right. They're running all right under UNHCR supervision with WFP and others. But there are major problems, of course. But I think in terms of provision of food and basic services, the UN does provide those services.
Question from the young man up here on the side.
Thank you again for your time today. Of the many things that concerned me with your talk, going back to Pakistan and the madrasa, with the schools there, I don't know if this is an accurate description, but it seemed that there might potentially be centers where children are being indoctrinated into being martyrs or fighters for a cause that they might not know a lot about. Should there be Western or UN criticism if they can identify and distinguish? Because I also know that in the madrasa, correct me if I'm wrong, is the Arab word for school. Is it able to distinguish between a school and a fundamentalist school? And if there isn't an alternative, should one be sought by the UN or by the international community?
Yeah. Well, what we're doing, this is in Afghanistan, one of the things that we're trying to do with the Ministry of Education is, the thing is that many families prefer to send their children to madrasas because they're religious schools rather than to government-run secular schools. So the issue then is, how do you affect the curriculum in the madrasas? So now the strategy in Afghanistan is that we don't close down madrasas, but we require that they teach certain things and to set in a curriculum where there are certain things like science and there's a minimum core that you would teach. And so they're trying to approach it that way. And I think UNICEF and others are working with the Ministry of Education in Afghanistan about those issues. But Pakistan, of course, also at the moment don't have that kind of program, but I think it will have to be done at some point.
I want to follow up. You said what we need are resources. In order to be able to be more effective, we need monies. On a scale of 1 to 10, like how much money do we have? Or does the UN have, or has invested in trying to do this?
Which?
To stop the recruiting of the soldiering, and then the other part, to work on the rehabilitation.
Right, the 2 years.
Yeah, for rehabilitation, we really do need funding, UNICEF and others with regard to. And actually, as she was saying, we don't ourselves do the rehabilitation. We are empowering others in the community to do that, but we need people to do that.
So do they have put aside a large sum of money? Do all countries chip in a little bit?
Well, at the moment they're fundraising, mainly among the European Union and to raise that funding, and Japan to raise that funding for those programs.
I'm afraid the era of the trick-or-treating for UNICEF orange boxes has gone away, but I mean,
no,
I know you can still...
It was there last night.
Oh, was it? Because I know you can now give online, and it's encouraged, but the children still carry around the boxes?
No, he had it at the dinner last night.
Oh, fantastic.
Oh, he had
okay.
it at dinner?
We encouraged everybody to get dressed up in their most outlandish outfits, go in their neighborhoods and collect money for UNICEF.
And trick-or-treat.
Collected money at the dinner.
Well, I asked the question.
I said bring it back. It was
I asked the question specifically about funding, because if we want to get rid of cancer, we need to raise money for this. If we want to do this, we need to have money for this. And if we want to stop it, as much as we can identify where it is, then as you said, you need money for that. But on the other hand, you can't stop doing something because you don't have the money. But I just wanted to know, was there a plan to try to get more money?
There is a plan. And it's basically done not only, it's not a huge fund for all reintegration, it's done country by country. The raising of the funding for these reintegration programs is done, so it's for, as you know, the Central African Republic. Now 2 armed groups have decided to release their children, so we're raising funds for that. Then in the Philippines, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front is releasing children, so money for that. So it's not some huge slush fund.
No. I understand. You're getting it as you need it.
Per country.
Thank you.
I want to thank the Undersecretary General for coming to KU and the Dole Institute, and thank you all for coming on a Friday morning. Thank you.